I'm so grateful to all of you. I did not expect that in this weather so many of you would come. So thank you very much for coming. Today, as you know, is the annual United Nations Commemoration Day for the Holocaust, which resulted in the murder of 1/3 of the Jewish people. It is 80 years since the Red Army liberated Auschwitz and liberated something like 7,000 prisoners who were still there. They came too late, alas, for the 1.1 million who were murdered in Auschwitz before the liberation. The German killing machine did not target Jews only, but also millions of Poles, Russians, and countless Roma. I grieve them all. I would like to speak today of the universal implications of the Holocaust and of the importance of not letting atrocities happen, not to be a bystander. I think of Martin Luther King's admonition that an individual has not started living until he or she can rise above the narrow confines of his individual concerns to the broader concerns of all humanity. Despite the thousands of pages written and said about the Holocaust, I am still at a loss in trying to understand it. How one of the most cultured peoples in Europe, which produced the world's greatest composers, philosophers, and poets, could invent, enforce, and docilely follow the first industrial genocide in human history remains for me an enigma. In my reflection this afternoon, I will speak of the mystery of the Holocaust, of its history and horrors, of the moral complicity of the bystanders, but also of the few righteous who risked their lives to help. The shattering acts of the Holocaust still defy logic and belief. Of course, mass atrocities, even genocides, have been committed throughout history. But the Holocaust was the first ever industrial genocide. That hatred, bigotry, and anti-Semitism could lead to an amazingly efficient, technological, scientifically informed, bureaucratically run death machine and the continent-wide losses, not only of individuals, families, and whole communities, but of basic humanity and shared human dignity as well, boggles the mind even now. They were of a sort that the world has never seen. That people as cultured and educated as Germans could accept being ruled by monsters such as Hitler, a personification of absolute evil, and that people of occupied Europe could largely collaborate with the enforcement of the Holocaust remains a mystery and a stain. And if it could happen in the country of Bach, Goethe, and Kant, could it not, given the right circumstances, happen in any country? And could not most of us become perpetrators of genocide? That is why we must remain vigilant and make sure that genocides are never, anywhere allowed to happen again. Even today, we see so many examples of ongoing, very brutal and bloody ethnic and religious conflicts, ethnic and religious slaughters. Some of these are actually, in legal terms, genocides. We are aware of violence against immigrants. We are aware of violence against Muslims. We are aware of violence against Jews. It is continuing against people in Darfur, against people in South Sudan and elsewhere. We must beware of demagogues who preach religious and ethnic hatred. By being vigilant, we may prevent a repeat of what happened in the 30s and 40s in Europe. The Holocaust, legally, is a prime example of genocide. If we do not remember, if we do not learn the lesson of the Holocaust, we might let those crimes to be repeated. It is important to call the crime by its name. Words have resonance. The definition of crimes has resonance. Judgments of international courts on genocide have resonance. By focusing on history, by focusing on the understanding of the Holocaust, we build a better future in which Holocausts become less likely. It was amazing how easily, in auspicious circumstances, ordinary, reasonable, decent people could transform into denouncers, plunderers, and killers. Reading about the Holocaust, I was struck by how methodically it developed from an anti-Semitic project of persecution and Aryanization of Jewish businesses, from ethnic cleansing to a project of dehumanization, mass killing, extermination, genocide. Hitler proceeded step by step, wanting to make sure that the German public was supportive, or at least indifferent. Although the wearing of the distinguished yellow star was introduced in occupied Poland already in November 1939, it was only in the summer of 1941 that Hitler approved it for German Jews in Germany. Some Berlin Jews were deported to killing camps as late as April 1943. The killing of Jews was preceded in Germany by killing of handicapped, non-Jewish German children. In 1938, following Hitler's written order, the so-called euthanasia order, directing the killing of disabled Germans. No written order from Hitler ordering the Holocaust was ever found. But on a number of occasions, including in the Reichstag in January 1939, Hitler spoke of, quote, the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe, unquote. In the 30s, the Nazis tried to force the emigration of Jews from Germany. But most countries simply refused to take any. The United Kingdom was a rare exception. The Kindertransport project saved some 10,000 children. The gases, carbon monoxide and zyklon, facilitated the technology of mass killing and reduced their cost. On October 23, 1941, the head of the SS, Himmler, issued an order forbidding emigration of Jews from Europe. Killing, not emigration, became the preferred way of getting rid of Jews. With the invasion of the Soviet Union by Germany in June 1941, the famous Operation Barbarossa, well before the first gas chamber started functioning, 4 operation groups, the Einsatzgruppen, initially fewer than 3,000 men, divided into commando groups, aided by the German police, local militias, and occasionally the army, the Wehrmacht, captured Jews and to economize on bullets, did not kill them by machine guns, but by single shots in the back of the head. The first mass killings of the Holocaust. And gassing was even cheaper. The commandant of Auschwitz, Rudolf Hess, testified in his trial in Poland after the war that the cost of cyclone gas for a per capita killing in Auschwitz was about 2 German Pfennig, which is less than 1 US cent in 1942. In January 1942, a conference was held in Wannsee, a beautiful suburb of Berlin, called by the SS to coordinate the deportation of Jews of occupied Europe to Poland for mass murder. The participants in Wannsee were the SS, the Gestapo, and state secretaries of the ministries concerned. The instructions to the Wannsee conference were signed not by Hitler. He was quite careful to avoid leaving papers signed by him and ordering having anything to do with the Holocaust. They were signed by Hitler's deputy, Goering. In his letter, he appointed Reinhard Heydrich, later named the Butcher of Prague, one of the top leaders of the SS, to prepare an overall and final solution of the Jewish question in German-controlled Europe. A final solution means, of course, total annihilation. It is the same Reinhard who only 5 months later was assassinated by the Czech resistance in Prague, and this resulted in one of the famous slaughters of the Second World War, the elimination and killing of all the inhabitants of the village of Lidice. Now, I have been wondering about that because I read that the father of Reinhard was head of a famous conservator of music, and he specialized in singing Wagner in the opera, which for me meant something that I learned from that cultured family is not a guarantee against brutalization and murder. The attitude of the local populations was a major factor in determining country priorities for deportations and mass killings. In the Wannsee conference, which I have just mentioned, the foreign ministry, the Secretary General of the Foreign Ministry of Germany, warned the participants about opposition that he expected, not in all the countries, just in Scandinavian countries, against deportation of Jews. As a result, the Holocaust, which the Germans originally planned to start in Western Europe, started in Eastern Europe, where the target populations were concentrated, anti-Semitism was rampant, and there was little risk of local opposition. In choosing Poland for the location of 6 concentration or gassing camps, the Nazis were motivated also by the intent of creating space, Lebensraum, for settling people of German origin, the Volksdeutsche, from the USSR and the Baltic states. Killing of local, non-Jewish populations was motivated also by the policy of trying to feed the German army of the land. Millions of Catholic Poles, especially the elites of clergy, intellectuals, officers who could have led resistance to the Nazis, were murdered. Killing of Jews was facilitated by the success of the dehumanization of Jews, by the propaganda claiming the Jews were the enemy whose annihilation was necessary for the survival and self-defense of Germany. They were accused even of causing German defeat in World War I. The tradition of obedience, loyalty to the group, patriotism facilitated the task of gruesome killings. But the bloody sight was at times too much, even for the executioners. Members of the Einsatzgruppen would be offered frequently alcohol before the killings. Curiously, opting out of the killing was usually unpunished, but it was rare, so rare that it did not create any logistical problems for the killing apparatus. There were more than enough willing participants. If German morality was not a factor, I have been asking myself whether the Holocaust was economically a good idea. Such questions were not even raised during the Wannsee Conference. This is not surprising, because the slightest expression of doubt about the killing project would attract suspicion, condemnation, or worse. Besides, mad hatred would trump any economic considerations. In his 2017 book, Why? Explaining the Holocaust, Peter Hayes shows that the Holocaust was, in fact, a profitable exercise. Low tech, low cost, low investment, highly efficient. Plunder of Jewish property, real estate, gold, and jewelry was enormous and provided means for Nazi trading with the neutral Switzerland and Sweden. Concentration camp laborers were lent by the SS to German industries, which had to pay handsomely for labor. The height of the perversion actually occurred in Western Europe. The Nazis made Jews pay for their train transportation to the killing fields in the East. The downside for Germany was, of course, the loss of thousands of scientists and engineers, first through emigration and then through killing. Towards the end of the war, Germany did suffer a major lack of manpower. Let me now talk about bystanders during the Holocaust. Murders on the scale of the Holocaust are not possible when the body politic stands up for the rule of law, human dignity, and equality for all. The murder of 6 million Jews would not have been possible without the acquiescence, if not complicity, of the peoples of Germany and occupied Europe. The Holocaust could not have happened without those who diverted their eyes while having a pretty good idea what the deportations were all about, and yet did and said nothing. And yes, there are situations where silence equals complicity. As a collectivity, the bystanders bear a heavy moral responsibility, but it is more difficult to assess in the abstract the moral responsibility of every individual bystander. Different roles of acquiescence, complicity, participation, each type of involvement attracts different and increasing moral responsibility. Every person's circumstances, such as knowledge, proximity, and ability to help, must be taken into account. In the rare cases where people rejected as immoral complicity with the Holocaust, as in Denmark or in the Protestant hamlet of Chambon-sur-Lignon in France, Jews were saved. Why did the majority simply stand by? The fear of German retribution against the rescuer and his or her family was a major factor. It was not only the rescuer, but the protester that faced a heavy risk of severe Nazi retribution. And while the French Cardinal Gerlier, Archbishop Saliège, and a number of French bishops and Protestant clergy, as well as the Archbishop of Berlin, Graf von Preysing, made statements in support of Jews without being sanctioned by the Nazis, this was not necessarily reassuring for lower profile priests. Still, such statements did lead to a considerable increase in shelter granted to Jews in Catholic convents. There was anti-Semitism, the dehumanization of Jews, so effectively disseminated by Goebbels' propaganda machine. And yet, a country as anti-Semitic as Poland at that time had the highest number of just proportional to the population who risked their lives to save Jews. There was a social stigma attaching to the Jews, which discouraged others from speaking up for the Jews. Minds had been poisoned. There was the satisfaction of getting rid of competitors or persons who often were different and resented and often envied by the majority. There was the self-interest in benefiting from Jewish property, medical and legal practices, university posts. There was the prospect of material advantage as multitudes benefited from assets, businesses, and apartments left behind by murdered or deported Jews. For some, there was the sadistic joy of getting rid of Jews. There was the Catholic Church with its great influence, which was often anti-Semitic and mostly conspicuously silent, and which nevertheless, especially in its convents, saved a great many Jews. There was the tradition of respect and obedience for authority and leadership. This was a major factor for compliance, even in a country historically as friendly to Jews as the Netherlands. In Germany, there was a real cult of authority, which may have facilitated the idea of supremacy of Hitler's orders, Führerbefehl. There was the ubiquitous tendency to turn away from the person in need next door. I would like to say something about the role of the Good Samaritan during the Holocaust. The New Testament story of the Good Samaritan is really linked with the duty to love one's neighbor. Who is the neighbor who must be helped, who must be saved, who should be saved? Were Jews regarded as such? When challenged by a lawyer as to how to inherit eternal life, Jesus, as per Luke 10 and Matthew 22, answers, first, that he must love God. And second, that he should love thy neighbor as thyself. And then, in answering the lawyer's follow-up question, and who is my neighbor? Jesus answers with the parable of the Good Samaritan. Helping a person in need is advocated not only by the Gospels, but also by philosophers of ethics. Already Kant puts it well, and I quote, "Beneficence towards those in need is a universal duty of human beings. Already the Old Testament, Leviticus 19, commands, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." St. Augustine advocates the idea of universality of the concept of the neighbor. Every human being is a neighbor to every other human being, he says, whether Christian or not. Sermon 8. At the times these texts were written, I would think that neighbor simply meant the person next door. But by making the victim anonymous, Luke makes proximity and identity irrelevant to our duties to universal humanity. And the Sermon on the Mountain, Matthew 5, has Jesus go beyond loving one's neighbors to the duty to love one's enemies. Perhaps the best example of Good Samaritans were the people of Denmark. Their transporting all Danish Jews to Sweden and saving them was an extraordinary humanitarian rescue operation during the darkest days of the Holocaust. Yet, the massive participation by the Danish people and the leadership from the king down likely reduced the risk for individual Danes as they acted within a culture of resistance that gave more protection from betrayal and punishment. Surprisingly, perhaps, it was in southeastern Europe, in Bulgaria, and partly in Romania, rather than in Western and Central Europe, that the opposition of populations prevented the Holocaust from being fully enforced. It is the just or the righteous Gentile who risked their lives to save Jews and did it not for gain or personal advantage, but for morality and shared humanity. And while a tiny number in comparison to the millions of bystanders, those that were given the Yad Vashem Award of the Just still run into close to 30,000 people. And there were many who saved Jews, but no one bore witness and reported on their deeds. I think of unknown, unsung heroes. We should admire the just, not only for risking their lives and the lives of their families, but also for doing something which at the time was not popular with their communities. I admire their altruism, their shared perception of a common humanity, their readiness to swim against the current, their heroism. It is the just and the Good Samaritans, always vastly outnumbered by the bystanders, who might restore our faith in humanity. Alas, they were always so rare. Already in the biblical story of wicked Sodom, even 10 righteous could not be found to save Sodom from destruction, which spared only the righteous Lot. Genesis 18:19. I think of the just. I think of two examples which I would like to cite to you. The first, Aristides de Sousa Mendes, the Portuguese consul in Bordeaux, who in defiance of explicit orders saved thousands of Jews by giving them visas to go to Portugal, and was as a result destroyed by Salazar, the leader of Portugal at the time. I think of the Pole Jan Karski, a resistance officer who infiltrated the Warsaw Ghetto, just think of the tremendous risk, and a concentration camp, and then traveled to the West, traveled to the UK, and traveled to the United States to report to the governments of the Allies on the unbelievable annihilation which was being inflicted on Jews. Alas, bombing rail lines to the death camp advocated by Karski was not on the Allies' priority list. It is from acts of humanity that seeds of reconciliation and a shared sense of humanity emerge. Remembrance and acknowledgement of historic crimes, coming clean with the past, is essential to the process of reconciliation. And I pay homage to President Chirac of France, who, breaking with a very long taboo, accepted the responsibility of France for Vichy's collaboration with the enforcement of the Holocaust, for committing, in the words of Chirac, the irreparable. In my reflections on the Holocaust, I avoided discussing the role of God. I will do so now. If God, whom we believe to be almighty and benevolent, used the Holocaust as punishment for the sinners, why afflict the innocents, the children, the babies, the disabled? Was God in Auschwitz? Was he in Treblinka? How to reconcile what happened there with our belief in God? And should the victims of the Holocaust, in their last thoughts before slaughter, turn to God, would they make a prayer for survival or a complaint for abandonment? St. Matthew's Passion draws on Psalm 22, written much earlier in the time of King David. Psalm 22 starts with a complaint and turns into a prayer. But Christ on the cross cites only the complaint. It's a heartbreaking complaint. My God, why hast thou abandoned me? And I think that victims of Holocaust probably followed suit. But giving up our belief in God would mean also giving up hope for a better world and the hereafter. Jürgen Moltmann, in his book Theology of Hope, 1993, writes, and I quote, "Living without hope is like no longer living." And that it is no accident, he writes, that at the entrance to Dante's hell in the Divine Comedy, the description reads, and I quote, "Abandon hope, all ye who enter here." Abandon hope, all ye who enter here. But not believing would make us neither happier nor better human beings. And I thank you all.